we have to be very, very careful. What we're talking is not so much democracy, we're talking organised hypocrisy. Hard facts. If ever a year was deserving of the appellation tempestuous, it was 2017. From Trump's inauguration in January, an event underpinned by and suffused with Nero-esque triumphalism, all the way through to the 45th president's bombastic recognition of Jerusalem as Israel's capital in December, Russophobia hovered over the West like a spectre, calling to mind the dog days of McCarthyism. The hysteria that engulfed a Washington liberal establishment, and by extension the West, over Russia's, well, very existence, it seemed, only confirmed what we already knew, that the US is a superpower in decline, and Donald Trump, let there be no doubt, is a symptom of this decline, not the cause that his liberal opponents would have us believe. Indeed, rather than any kind of aberration, Donald J. Trump is America with its mask removed, a man and leader who embodies the vulgar capitalism, rampant individualism, white supremacy and might is right ethos that are as American as apple pie. That said, in terms of the size of its economy, its military and geopolitical reach, not forgetting cultural weight, the United States remains the world's predominant power. However, quantitative superiority does not necessarily translate into qualitative superiority, a truism that the events of 2017 confirmed. For just as there is nothing so powerful as an idea whose time has come, 2017 was a year in which the multipolar alternative to Washington's unipolarity made its presence felt as never before. Russia's military and diplomatic efforts in the Middle East, specifically with regard to the conflict in Syria, bore fruit as the Syrian Arab Army and its allies, continuing the momentum gained as a result of the liberation of Aleppo at the end of 2016, moved east into Daesh-controlled territory and managed to break the 3-year-long siege of Deir ez-Zor before going on to eradicate the presence of Daesh from the country altogether. It subsequently embarked on a military operation to liberate Idlib province in northwest Syria, where the last significant presence of Salafi jihadi groups is located. That said, not until the last US airman and soldier has left a country they've been operating in illegally will Syria's sovereignty be secure, or at least as secure as it can be given Israel's aggressive posture under Netanyahu and given a Saudi leadership that remains committed to the pursuit of an anti-Shia, anti-Iran agenda, one that's been responsible for inflicting unutterable suffering on the people of Yemen. Elsewhere, Venezuela found itself placed under economic and political siege by Washington, doing so in support of an entrenched domestic oligarchy which remains committed to overturning the government of Nicolas Maduro and with it the Bolivarian revolution inspired by Hugo Chavez. In a part of the world the US ruling class has long considered its own backyard. The crisis involving the Korean Peninsula was another seismic story of this past year, where throughout the prospect of direct military confrontation loomed large, while Europe continues to struggle with the fallout from the collapse of neoliberalism in 2008, confirmed most significantly by the threat of Catalonia's separatism from Spain. Previous to this constitutional crisis in Madrid, the EU had managed to avoid the potential challenge to its existence of a Marine Le Pen presidency in Paris, with the French people opting instead for centrist Emmanuel Macron in that country's elections in April-May. This perhaps has been reflected in Brussels' assertive and uncompromising stance during Brexit negotiations with a British government headed by Theresa May. May went from leading the chorus of UK establishment ridicule of Labour's Jeremy Corbyn at the start of 2017 to losing her party's parliamentary majority in a snap general election in June. An election she'd called in a fit of hubris and with the full expectation of a Corbyn wipeout. But Corbyn, this most unlikely of prospective prime ministers, in most people's estimation hitherto, confounded the polls, a hostile media and the aforesaid UK establishment, with a performance that proved that Thatcherism has perhaps finally lost its lustre within a society ravaged by years of austerity. The question, as 2017 draws to a close, is will Theresa May survive long into 2018, or will she be replaced in Downing Street by, per Orwell, a sandal-wearing, fruit juice drinking socialist in the form of Jeremy Corbyn? Never mind Theresa May, will Donald Trump survive 2018? What with Robert Mueller's investigation closing in? Could we possibly see a man who began the year with his fist clenched in triumph in front of the Capitol building in Washington at the close of his inauguration being forced out of the White House in ignominy next year? Finally, in 2017, China's rise continued unabated. It did so under a leader, Xi Jinping, who cemented Communist Party control over the levers of the country's economic and political power, charting a course towards increased geopolitical influence in line with the country's seemingly unstoppable economic growth. The ongoing decline of a West that remains wedded to a failed neoliberal economic model and regime change fanaticism, and the rise of an East that offers hope to a global South that for far too long has suffered under the weight of Western hegemony. This, if anything, is the real story of 2017. I'm John White, and you're listening to a special end-of-year episode of Hard Facts. Well, if I'm going to spend the next hour going over the seismic events of 2017, who better to spend it with than two of my favourite contributors, author and journalist Neil Clark and journalist and editor of Politics First magazine, Marcus Papadopoulos. Welcome to the show, gentlemen.
Hi, John. Thanks.
Hello there, John. Pleasure to be back on.
Marcus, cast your mind back, if you would, to January 20th and Trump's inauguration, an event, as I say, that was underpinned by a surreal atmosphere of triumphalism. This was a man who was sworn in not with the demeanour of someone who'd been elected to serve, but someone who'd been born to rule. He seemed the most unlikely of presidents, but then again, was he, given the trajectory of events in the country and given the deplorable record of his opponent, Hillary Clinton, doyen of a liberal establishment that had become detached from the lives of working people. But many commentators in 2016 during the presidential election had placed hopes in Trump, given his positive statement with regard to resetting relations with Russia, with reorienting US foreign policy to focus on the common threat that Russia and the US and the West face in the form of international terrorism emanating from the Middle East, its most potent symbol of which was Daesh. Many people had placed hopes that Trump would offer a step change from the status quo, but you were one of the very few who flew in the face of this consensus, and you warned that Trump would, rather than be any kind of break from the status quo, that he would be essentially the status quo times 10. Remind listeners what it was you saw, or what you discerned in Trump that many of us did not.
Well, John, there is a shocking level of naivety concerning Donald Trump. And throughout the American presidential election, and since he took office, I maintained my view that Donald Trump is no saviour. Donald Trump would not change American foreign policy. Donald Trump has long been a part of the American establishment, and specifically the business component of the American establishment. He, prior to the American presidential election, he was, politically speaking, an unknown quantity. He said many things that he only said in order to stand out from his opponent, Hillary Clinton. And the danger that comes with supporting someone who is an unknown political quantity is that you do not have the slightest idea about what they truly stand for. Let's not forget, he never stood for elected office before. He had never been elected before. And while people, even to this day, are still saying that Donald Trump is being forced into all these decisions by the deep state, or as I prefer to call it, the establishment. Well, that is a very, very weak argument, because you can apply that to every single American president. Let's not forget, Barack Obama, George Bush, and Bill Clinton all came into office vowing to improved relations with Russia. And what happened? They all failed in that objective. So, yes, I do believe that once someone becomes president in America, the machines of the American government, they come around that person. But they have come around Donald Trump. They came around Barack Obama. So when people say that Donald Trump attacked the Syrian airbase this April because he was forced into doing that by the American establishment, then you have to apply that argument to Barack Obama and say, well, he supported the numerous Islamist terrorist groups in Syria because the American establishment forced him into doing that. Now, there is truth there, but at the same time, with Donald Trump, there is another aspect to it. I believe, and I said last year, and I've said since he became president, that he stood for office in order to enhance his own standing in the world and to enhance the standing of his friends in the world. It's not about America first, which, by the way, is a banal slogan. It's about Trump first and his friends first. And two of his major friends in the world are Saudi Arabia and Israel. Since he took office, he has signed numerous agreements with Saudi Arabia worth hundreds of billions of dollars. And when it comes to Israel, of course, he has now recognized Jerusalem as the capital of Israel. And let's not forget, John, as well, one of the major supporters of Donald Trump is Sheldon Adelson. He's the man who introduced Donald Trump and Benjamin Netanyahu to each other 20 or 25 years ago. And of course, Donald Trump has now done a very big favor in return to Sheldon Adelson and to Benjamin Netanyahu in recognizing Jerusalem as the capital of Israel. Adelson was the main donor to Trump's campaign. So Trump is increasing his standing in the world through his dealings with the Saudi Arabians and the Israelis, and in return, he's given them what, in his eyes, a friend should give.
You've just been listening to Marcus Papadopoulos. I'm also joined by Neil Clark. In the next part of this end-of-year special, I'd like Neil to come in and give me his analysis of the reasons for Trump's election. Don't go anywhere. We'll be right back.
Hard facts.
Welcome back to this end-of-year special review of 2017. I'm joined here with Neil Clark and Marcus Papadopoulos. Neil, Marcus gave quite a withering indictment of Donald Trump, the man's character and his motives. I didn't hear anything that I could really disagree with, but I'd like to get I'd like to get into the substance of the decline of the liberal establishment in Washington. I mean, Hillary Clinton had approached the election in 2016 more as a coronation than as an attempt to be elected as the country's president. Now, since Trump's election, this liberal establishment has gone into paroxysms of anger and rage with these so far baseless allegations of Russian interference, whatever that might be, in the US election. What does this tell us about the state of American politics? And what do you make of this unending Russophobic narrative that has pervaded 2017 throughout the West?
Well, it's pretty clear, John, I think Marcus will agree with me here, that the general establishment in the United States, we call it deep state, or the establishment, as Marcus has called it, the majority of it did prefer a Clinton win, simply because they knew 100% what they would be getting. With Trump, Trump's a maverick. There was the fact is that the establishment knew they'd probably need 6 months to whip him into line, which is what has happened. So Clinton was a safer bet for them, the embedded elites, if you like, in America. And as you said, it was seen to be a coronation. Bernie Sanders ran a very good campaign. He was, some people would say, cheated out of it. We know what happened there. Bernie Sanders and his radicalism perhaps would have posed a much bigger threat to Trump. Because what happened was, of course, Hillary Clinton took it for granted that she would win. She was very confident. The press were overwhelmingly pro-Clinton. I was in America early last year, and every paper I picked up was glowing about Clinton. It was seen as a coronation. And of course, Trump clever man that he is, undoubtedly, he knew that he could adapt a populist tone, particularly in the so-called Rust Belt states where people had been left behind, high unemployment, wages stagnating or going down. These were the sort of areas in America where the Democrats would have mopped up normally. But of course, in this sort of Clintonian period, there's been a genuflection to capital. The Democrats have been what you call, the Wall Street faction under the Clintons, and they neglected their working class base. And so Trump could go in there, which he did, and make an appeal to American workers.
So do you discern that it was a collapse of class-based politics, but the focus on identity politics that that produced this backlash against the liberal establishment, and Trump was perceived as the anti-establishment candidate whilst being as establishment as he come?
Yeah, because what's happened, John, if you look at politics, and it happened in Britain too, is that the main parties of the centre-left embraced identity politics at the expense of class-based politics. Now, of course, there were always, if you call lifestyle liberals in the Democrat Party before that, but there was still, the party did pitch its appeal to working-class blue-collar voters. It stopped doing that. Clinton became the darling of Wall Street, of Goldman Sachs. You could call it, I've called it the Sorosification of the liberal left in America, in fact, where identity politics issues become the all-important thing. But if you're a working-class person in Ohio, you've lost your job, your wages are stagnating, if you have a job, what you want is work. What you want is your economic concerns addressed by the party that you thought that was what it was about. And of course, Clintons were very much part of the US elite, and the Democrat Party moved away from its base and paid the penalty. Donald Trump went in there and he cleverly posed as the champion of American workers. He was going to protect American jobs, perhaps go down a protectionist route. And that did chime with American voters in those. That's why he did so well in the Rust Belt states. And so that really the reason for Trump, and we can say the same reason for Brexit, we can say the same reason for the rise of the right in Europe as well. We've got to link that into it because that's another factor about 2017, John, the rise of the right in Europe. I know Le Pen didn't win.
Yes, I'm going to get into... Marcus, on Le Pen, if we could just shift to you, Marcus, on Le Pen, how significant was the result in the French elections in your mind I've touched on this in the introduction, with regard to basically the preservation of the EU in its current form, because I think it was clear that if Le Pen, and for a while she was riding high in the polls, that if she had won, then the future of the EU would have been very bleak indeed. Your thoughts?
Well, I don't profess to be an authority on French politics, but about a month or so prior to the French presidential election, I had a very, very interesting chat with a French commentator, and he told me this, John: if Le Pen won the presidential election, that would be one thing, but her presidency would be handicapped because she would not have had anywhere near a majority in the French Parliament. The French commentator I was speaking to told me that at most she would have got maybe 20 members of the French Parliament. So even though she would have been president, all her policies, all her manifesto pledges, she would not have been able to implement them because the French Parliament would not have approved them. So he told me that, imagine this scenario: Le Pen is president, but she's paralyzed because she does not control the French Parliament. Now, I found that a very, very enlightening analysis. And I think what it showed was that even if Le Pen did win, and by the way, I like in the American presidential election, I didn't support anyone in the French presidential election, but even if she did win, there was not really going to be a threat to the European Union. There was not really going to be a threat to France's membership of NATO or to bring about a change in French foreign policy because her presidency would have been handicapped, so to speak.
But what about on the level of being a catalyst for the far right, which Neil mentioned, this rising tide of centrifugal far right forces at the heart of the EU? Neil, she would have certainly been a flag bearer for that movement, wouldn't she have?
Yeah, I think we've got to understand that when we talk about the far right, there are different economic policies for different far right parties in Europe. I mean, the Front National has adopted quite a dirigiste
Yes.
almost socialistic economic policy, which is state ownership against privatisation, whereas other far-right parties are neoliberal parties.
Yes.
Like Mr. Wilders' party in the Netherlands, which is a sort of Thatcherite with anti-immigrant rhetoric.
Indeed.
So there are differences in these far-right parties on their economic policies. Some of them are absolutely uber free market.
But the thing they have in common, Neil, is that the way that they've been very effective in channeling people's justifiable anger and alienation over many, many years of rampant inequality, neoliberal economic model that's clearly collapsed in the wake of the 2008 economic collapse. Now, this brings us into Brexit territory. What an absolute unending disaster that has engulfed the British political class. How do you see this ending? I mean, it seems to me that we're almost at the point where the EU knows that it has Britain by the tail, and that it has a UK government that's never been more weak. We have a Prime Minister in Theresa May who's been reduced to a political mannequin. That's how low her authority is, even within her own cabinet. I mean, what brought us to this point where we have a Tory government after an EU referendum with no plan for Brexit?
Absolutely. I think it all goes back, John, back to the rise of the right and back to what the left parties didn't do. There's a great book written by Steve Hall called The Rise of the Right, published this year, which I reviewed for Sputnik. And his argument, which I agree with totally, was that the main parties of the left in Europe basically did what the Democrats did in the US. They embraced neoliberal reforms. They abandoned their working class base. This led to the rise of the populist right. And of course, the EU, many of these parties, the centre-left were prominent in the EU, they didn't fight for a genuinely pro-worker EU. They accepted neoliberal policies, they accepted austerity, which is a very key point. And that was the climate for the Brexit referendum. The climate for the Brexit referendum, John, was 7 or 8 years of declining real wages, the biggest fall in living standards in the UK since the 1930s. And so, overwhelmingly in the country in 2015, there was an overwhelming feeling, in 2016 and 2015 too, of wanting to land a punch at the establishment. The establishment which had destroyed our jobs, which had imposed wage freezes on us, while all the time the prices are going up. And what better way to do that was by voting to leave the EU. I honestly believe that if that vote had taken place a decade earlier, say in 2005-6, it would have gone a different way. So that it was an anger vote. And this is the key point now. The British establishment, the British Tory party, generally wasn't for Brexit. Theresa May, let's face it, was a Remainer. They now got this commitment to a referendum by David Cameron, called simply because he feared Tory voters going to UKIP. UKIP itself, the rise of UKIP was caused by the process I've just explained, which is why the left parties went absent and allowed people like Farage to come in and gain votes in areas where Labour should have been doing well.
Yeah, sorry, Farage's rise in the context of Brexit, I mean, he's never had success in normal elections and parliamentary elections, it has to be mentioned, but he did manage to ride a wave of, as I said, anger. But his rise and the rise of the Tory right in the context of the EU and the arguments for Brexit has to be understood in the context of a Labour Party that had abandoned its working class base.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, absolutely. And we look at I think it was the big surge, wasn't it, in the 2014 European elections where UKIP topped the poll. It was the first time a party other than the Labour Conservatives had topped a national poll for 100 years in Britain. And that, of course, sent the alarm bells ringing in the Tory party HQ. And that made David Cameron made the pledge to have a referendum, which he fully thought he would win. He thought it would be a rerun of IndyRef. You know, the polls might be wobbling a week before, but we'll get the big heavyweights out, get Richard Branson out, etc., and the people will vote to remain. It went badly wrong for them. So then the Tory establishment have this public vote, which went the wrong way for them. And they really didn't know what to do. They weren't keen on Brexit. They knew they couldn't openly ignore the vote. And so that's why we've had this chaos since then. We've got a deeply divided government. And of course, Theresa May only compounded her own problems by calling that election in June this year caused by hubris. She honestly believed that the media propaganda about Corbyn and Labour being unelectable, all those wonderful, wonderful left-wing liberal pundits in the New Statesman and elsewhere telling us that Labour was heading for Armageddon in the election. And she got the surprise, and the Tories got the surprise of their life. So we're in this position now where basically the only Brexit we can get is a totally fudged one that probably won't make anybody happy and will only create this crisis, make sure the crisis goes on well into 2018.
Yeah, they thought that the election in June would spell the end of Corbyn's leadership of the Labour Party, when instead it's actually cemented his leadership, solidified it, and it's also sped Theresa May's leadership on the way to demise. Now, quickly before we hit the next break, Neil, do you think Britain will eventually leave the EU? We have about 30 seconds.
I think that the odds are that we will leave it in a way that is staying in orbit now. We'll have a totally fudge, the softest of soft Brexits.
Okay, you're listening to author and journalist Neil Clark, and also journalist and editor of Politics First, Marcus Papadopoulos. I'm John White, and this is Hard Facts.
Hard Facts.
Welcome back to this special edition of Hard Facts. Now, Marcus, I'm someone who's long been of the belief that in the US, a policy of social and economic injustice at home is the foundation for its regressive foreign policy. In North Korea, Venezuela, the Middle East, and indeed when it comes to the ongoing crisis in Eastern Europe with the latest tranche of sanctions. Trump, to be fair, had rhetorically opposed them, but the US Congress, to a man and woman, supported them. Now, in the Middle East, there's no doubt that the US has been revealed to be a giant with feet of clay. I think it's fair to say that Russia's intervention there has been a game changer, not only militarily, which began at the end of 2015, but also, perhaps more importantly at this stage, diplomatically. Where do you make of what's been happening in the Middle East? Daesh has been eradicated from Iraq. It has been eradicated from Syria. Given where we were 2 years ago, this is a phenomenal turn of events. Where do we go from here? I don't think the danger's over yet. I mentioned that the US still has a military presence in Syria, which is there illegally. What's the future for Syria?
There's no doubt about it that American global power has weakened, and it has weakened substantially. Gone are the days of the 1990s when America could do what it wanted in the world, knowing that Russia was on its knees, knowing that Russia was in political, economic, social and military meltdown. Now, those days are over, and one of the main reasons, or the main reason in my view, for American global power having decreased is the return of Russia to the international arena, which is an event, a reality that anyone who supports international law, anyone who supports the United Nations Charter, anyone who supports the mechanisms of the United Nations should be rejoicing about. That said, however, American power is absolutely formidable, and American global power is not going to collapse. Yes, America has near enough been defeated in Syria, but let's not forget, America lost the war in Vietnam, and people in the early 1970s were saying, could this be the decline of America? Well, they were wrong.
Yeah, we had the Vietnam syndrome, where the US was unable to embark on a full-scale military action for about 30 years until the first Iraq War in 1991.
We have to say that was because the Soviet Union at that time was on its deathbed. But we also have to take into consideration that in early parts of 2014, the Americans with the Europeans pulled off a coup in Ukraine. Now, that on its own demonstrates the incredible power that the Americans have. They pulled off a coup in Ukraine, a country which is absolutely crucial to the Russian national identity, to Russian culture, to Russian national security. They pulled off a coup in Kiev, the mother of all Russian cities, the birthplace of the Russian state. That's like the Russians pulling off a coup in Mexico or Canada. They did that in Russia's back door. Now, if we have a look at Syria, yes, there's no question about it. The Americans have failed in their objective to overthrow the Syrian government, to overthrow President Assad. Yes, They retain a presence in the north of the country where the Kurds are, but I believe that's a precarious presence. The Kurds in Syria have said that they do not want an independent country. They want some form of autonomy from Damascus. We also have to remember the Kurds not just been receiving help from the Americans, they've been receiving help from the Russians and from the Syrian government itself. Russia, through the American attempt to try and overthrow the Syrian government, has returned to the Middle East. Its influence and power has increased. There's no question about it. The relationship between Syria and Russia has increased even further as a result of Russia intervening in the military conflict. That said, however, American dominance in the Middle East still is unquestionable, but it has weakened. And as I said, it's really down to a resurgent Russia, but also it's down to social media. It's down to alternative media outlets like Sputnik. I know that Neil and I were talking about the Syrian conflict almost from day one, back in 2011. We were saying the same thing. And I'm sure Neil will agree with me when I say they were quite lonely days for us, because people really believed at that time that President Assad was this barbaric dictator. He hated Sunnis. He was waging a genocidal campaign against his own people. But slowly but surely, through the persuasive and tenacious arguments of Neil and myself and others as well, it has to be said, ordinary people in Britain have started to question what they were told about Assad. And really, it is down to outlets giving a voice to people like Neil and I that have influenced ordinary British people into saying, well, actually, who have our government been supporting in Syria, and why is President Assad really adored by so many of his own people? You know, I was talking to a Syrian the other day who told me this, that back in 2011, she had serious issues with the Syrian government. She wanted reform, but never, ever reform imposed from outside. Today, in 2017, she said she's absolutely committed to the Syrian government and to President Assad. Why? Because he maintains Syria's independence and sovereignty, and he fights the malignant scourge of Islamism.
Neil, Marcus has a point when he talks about the rising influence of social media. I'm minded of Churchill's aphorism when he said that in wartime the truth is so precious that she must always be attended by a bodyguard of lies. And there were a concatenation of lies told regarding the conflict in Syria right throughout, and it heated up in the context of the campaign to liberate Aleppo, which was ultimately successful. Now, but if you were following the mainstream narrative of that military campaign, you would have been forgiven for thinking that the Syrian Arab army, made up of conscripts drawn from every part of the mosaic that is Syrian society, was a latter-day Waffen SS, while the Salafi jihadi head choppers in East Aleppo were latter-day partisans or French resistance. What do you make of the declining influence of Western media, the mainstream media? And this is reflected, I think, in this unhinged campaign that's been waged against Russian media. And I know that you have been particularly a victim of this campaign in the context of a leading commentator who's been stalking you these past few years. Absolutely, yes, John. I've been stalked by a neocon commentator, stalked for over 10 years, and I've actually brought no other option but to bring an action for libel and harassment. I've crowdfunded the operation because the British legal system is incredibly expensive, and if anybody wants to help, and all contributions, large or small, are greatly appreciated, they can do so via my blog, neilclark66blogspot.com. If they go to my Twitter feed, there's neilclark66. There's a link to my fundraiser page where people can donate by PayPal, and they can also donate via PO Box. I've got a PO Box 922 Oxford OX1 9RL. And I think that it's got a wider significance, my case, because, as I said, I've been attacked and defamed by a neocon commentator who's called me all manner of names, false accusations. And of course, one of the names that we get called, going back to Syria, is that if we did challenge the dominant the dominant narrative on Syria, we were labelled Assad apologists or dictator apologists.
genocide deniers, you name it. That's what we were called. I remember going back to what Marcus was saying on RT in 2011, I think it was, after a bomb attack on Syrian government officials. And the dominant line there was, it's a matter of days before the Syrian government falls. It's got no support. This is a sort of genocide government supported by nobody. And I went on RT and said that the Syrian government actually does have large-scale support within Syria, and it's not going to fall. And I was attacked for that as an Assad apologist. I was merely stating the truth. And the propaganda in the Syrian conflict has been quite extraordinary. And there's real anger out there, John, that RT called it right. The coverage of RT was totally accurate on Syria. 2011-12, the only people you could hear in the media who were actually telling how it was in Syria was on channels like RT. And of course, that explains why what I call the endless war lobby, the neocon endless war lobby, has been waging this obsessive, deranged campaign to get RT off air. The RT commentators are libelled. We've got this every day. We pick up certain newspapers and there's calls for Ofcom to act. What are they so frightened of?
Yes, good question.
On one hand, they tell us that channels like RT and Sputnik are basically, nobody's listening to them, nobody's watching them, and everybody that goes on is a crank, a genocide denier, you name it.
So what are they frightened of?
They're frightened of the truth. And the fact is that it was quite easy, John, to spin these illegal wars and so-called liberal interventions 10, 15 years ago. The Iraq War, the majority of the mainstream media parroted the stuff about WMDs, the great WMDs hoax. It's much harder now to sell intervention. And to prove the point, think back to 2013 in August, when the British government was desperate, was pleading with Parliament to get us involved to bomb the Syrian government at the behest of the US and the neocons. And there was a massive campaign on social media, write to your MP against this. It's not true, the narrative is wrong. We don't know for sure that it was the Syrian government that used these chemical weapons. Think back to Iraq and the WMD hoax. And what happened? Parliament voted against intervention. And the neocons were furious about that. That meant that then, of course, we could have had perhaps World War III if we had started bombing the Syrian government at that point. And that was a blow for them. And it's interesting that then, Marcus has mentioned Ukraine. When did the Ukraine regime change operation go into top gear? It was just after that. Ray McGovern, the former CIA analyst, recalls how he went on an American TV program just after the Syrian vote went the wrong way for the neocons in 2013. And there were two leading warmongers on with him, and they were so depressed, so angry about how way the British Parliament had voted. And soon after that, we got the Ukrainian operation kicked off. Victoria Nuland at the US State Department, the wife of Robert Kagan, the leading neocon. And that was all about, I believe, punishing Russia for thwarting regime change plans in Syria.
One thing we have to remember when it comes to Ukraine, yes, they were able to mount a coup in Ukraine, but the law of unintended consequences obtained inasmuch as they were able to mount this coup, but thereupon they lost Crimea. And in the next part of the show, I'd like to get into the significance of Vladimir Putin's announcement that he is to run for re-election in 2018. You're listening to Neil Clark and Marcus Papadopoulos. This is Hard Facts. Don't touch that dial. We'll be right back.
Hard Facts.
Welcome back to this special year-end episode of Hard Facts. We are exploring the seismic events of 2017. I'm doing so in the company of journalist and author Neil Clark and journalist and editor of Politics First magazine, Dr. Marcus Papadopoulos. Marcus, Vladimir Putin's announcement that he is to stand for re-election in 2018, how significant is that both domestically for Russia but also geopolitically for the rest of the world?
It needs to be said, first of all, John, that Russia is not the West. And there is no reason why Russia should be like the West. What I'm going to say now might not be tasteful to some or to many British and American politicians and mainstream journalists, but nonetheless, it is the reality of how Russians regard their leaders. The average Russian regards freedom as equaling anarchy. They regard democracy as a dirty word. Russians believe in the need for Russia to have a very strong leader with authoritarian traits. To the average Russian, the word authoritarian is not a dirty word. Russia, under Gorbachev and under Yeltsin, had very, very weak leaders who started to decentralize the country. And that is why, a reason why the Soviet Union collapsed, and that is why Russia descended into absolute anarchy during the 1990s, because it had that weak leader and it was decentralized. Now, Vladimir Putin became president in 2000. What did he do? One of the things straight away was to centralize Russia. Russia has to be centralized. Russia is a huge country. It is an extremely diverse country in all senses of the word. You have to have that very strong leader, that very authoritarian leader, running the country with an iron fist.
No, he is elected. Sorry, Marcus, he is obviously an elected leader. I get what you're saying. Do you not think there's a difference between democracy and liberal democracy in that sense?
The Russians have their own form of democracy, and indeed, in the Soviet Union, they had their own form of democracy. Okay, there was only one legal party, the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, but who was electing those people? And policies were voted on. The Russians have their own democracy, and in elections, they vote overwhelmingly for Vladimir Putin to be their president. But I have to make the point that people in Britain and America might not like the reality, but the Russians favor a strong authoritarian leader, providing that leader ensures that they have in their personal lives security and stability. They are absolutely content. They will not leave their house to protest. If the leader fails, if the leader does not ensure that they have jobs, salaries, pensions, then they will leave their house to protest. But apart from that, Russia needs that strong leader with an iron fist. And Vladimir Putin provides that. And that is why Vladimir Putin will be re-elected next year.
Neil, stability, I think, is a key word also when it comes to China. A remarkable event took place in October of this year. It was the 19th National Congress of the Chinese Communist Party. And China's leader, Xi Jinping, made a very bullish speech during which he cemented, as I said in my introduction, the Communist Party control over the country's economic and political direction going forward. And he said in his speech, and I'd like to quote this, the Chinese, it was a 3-hour speech, by the way, the longest of any Chinese leader in living memory since Mao. The Chinese nation has stood up, grown rich and become strong, and it now embraces the brilliant prospects of rejuvenation. It will be an era that sees China moving closer to centre stage and making greater contributions to mankind. Now, pondering those words, I can only surmise that there was a sense of dread in Washington. Give me your analysis of the role that China has played as part of the multipolar alternative that we've mentioned. Bear in mind that China has to its record the remarkable achievement of lifting 1.1 billion people out of poverty since 1990. Where does China go from here, Neil, and what is its role in the world, good and bad?
Well, I think, first of all, China has played a very important part in building up this more multipolar world that we didn't have in the 1990s. I think back to Syria again in 2012, I think it was, when the first of those very aggressive US-sponsored UN resolutions was put forward to the Security Council, which would have opened the door for Western military intervention, and China blocked it, along with Russia. And again, that was a key moment in that conflict, because there was a head of steam going up there in the West for intervention, and China blocked it. China, I think it would be a wholly positive move if China were to play an even more prominent role in geopolitical affairs around the world, working with Russia and working with the global South countries. Of course, China has made a lot of investments in global South countries in recent years. And so I think it would be wholly positive now if the speech that you referred to, if it does mean that China will play an even more prominent role than it has done over the past decade in building up an alternative, a strong counterbalance to United States and neocon aggressive policies. And I think this can be welcomed by anybody. Going back to what Marcus, anybody who supports the UN, the Charter of the UN, would get behind this, because we had that disastrous period in global affairs from the end of the Soviet Union until around about 2008, when basically the United States was able to do whatever it wanted. And look at the carnage that was caused, the Iraq War. Of course, we still had that with the Libyan intervention. So the rise of China, as you said, the speech will not have gone down well in the United States. Trump is playing an interesting game with China. He's obviously trying to court the Chinese over the North Korean issue. He had said some pretty tough stuff about China during his election campaign.
But he's also been very provocative when it comes to the issue of Taiwan at the same time.
Absolutely, but yes, of course, yes. So he's played a sort of double-edged game there. And it's quite clear that if we want to look positive about 2018, how can we bring finally to an end this terrible chapter, I think, of human history where we've had these terrible wars, neocon wars, launched by the US and its allies. The way we can bring that to an end fully is if we have a new world order with countries that put international law first at the helm. And China's role in this is going to be absolutely pivotal. The Chinese know that you cannot have military power around the world without economic power. And that's what they've concentrated on, building up the economic power. And I think the next decade is a decade where I fully expect to see China play a very prominent part in international affairs. And I think generally it will be a positive situation.
Marcus, Neil mentioned Libya there. One of the most grievous events of this year was the revelation that the slave trade has returned to Libya. And I want to take the opportunity to nail this down. You can be opposed to Donald Trump without being a supporter of Hillary Clinton. We can walk and chew gum at the same time. And cast your mind back to 2011, where in that infamous footage prior to a CBS interview, when she was the US Secretary of State, upon hearing the news of the murder, the brutal, savage murder of Muammar Gaddafi at the hands of a NATO-backed mob, she clapped her hands and laughed and said, "We came, we saw, he died." In 2017, we know that what she should have said was, "We came, we saw, Libya died." And if anybody wants to understand the monumental disaster of Western foreign policy over these past few years, which Neil eloquently laid out, surely it's Libya.
Look, John, my stance on Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump has been consistent. I believe the pair of them are loathsome politicians and even more loathsome human beings. It's as simple as that. Libya, you know, we were told the same old story that the West told the world during the wars in Yugoslavia, leading up to Iraq, that Libya is being run by a leader who wants to slaughter an entire part of his own population. And of course, I'm talking about the allegation that Colonel Gaddafi was planning to slaughter every single resident in Benghazi. Well, of course, that proved to be absolutely untrue. And something that isn't that well known, even amongst commentators like all three of us, is that the courtroom in Benghazi, where the so-called revolution began, of course it wasn't a revolution, it was an Islamist Wahhabist uprising, but the courtroom where it all began, by the end of 2011, was flying the Al-Qaeda flag. Now that is something that should be told time and again. What the Americans and the British and the French did in Libya was to support Islamist Wahhabist groups on the ground in order to overthrow Colonel Gaddafi, to seize the oil fields in Libya, and to take control of the arms markets in that country. And also it would solidify Western dominance in North Africa. It really is despicable that to this day, British politicians and British mainstream journalists talk about the horrors of the slave trade and the horrors of the refugee crisis. Now, I've seen the reports on the slave trade, and it is absolutely heartbreaking. It makes me so upset, but at the same time, it makes me furious. I've seen the plight of the refugees come into Europe via Libya. Once again, it is heartbreaking, but it makes me furious. Why does it make me furious when I listen to these wretched politicians and journalists in this country? Because they do not say what are the origins of this slave trade and this refugee crisis. Who caused it? You don't have to like Colonel Gaddafi. I didn't like him. I thought he was a pretty, a brutal person. But nonetheless, he was the legitimate leader of Libya, and he kept Islamists, Wahhabists out of his country. And he actually did a lot of good in the country in terms of education, health, and welfare. But, by removing him, the Americans, the British and the French have caused this slave trade. They have caused this refugee crisis. And quite frankly, the people who have come from North Africa and from sub-Saharan Africa into Europe via Libya are victims of Washington, London and Paris. And those poor people who have died are victims of those three capitals as well.
We're running out of time, guys, so if I can just press upon you, Marcus, I know that as a historian, the future is not your period. Give me your prediction. What will be the big event of 2018?
I believe that the conflict in Syria, probably by the end of 2018, will come to an end. I believe that the northwest of the country will be liberated, the northwest where al-Nusra is and the other Islamist group, the Free Syrian Army. And I believe that Syria will start to begin a new life for itself in the world, away from the Arab League. The Arab League is a wretched organisation. It was set up with good intentions, but it's a wretched organisation. It serves the West.
Sorry, Marcus, we're turning out of time. Neil, your prediction for 2018, please.
I just want to say one quick stat. Oxfam in January this year said that eight people owned half the world's wealth. And their new report comes out next January, just a month's time. I think we mustn't lose sight of the fact that this is probably one of the biggest issues in the world today is global inequality. And while we're talking about all this other stuff, let's keep a focus on that. And in that sense, I hope that 2018, we will see a shift in politics towards politics that puts inequality, that puts the economic needs of people right at the very top. And I very much hope that the British Labour Party continues its progress, but by staying radical, not by trying to appease moderates. And if it does stay radical, I think there's great things in store for Labour in the UK. You've been listening to Neil Clark and Marcus Papadopoulos. I'm John White, wishing you a happy and hopeful New Year. Until next time, remember, the only facts worth taking seriously are hard facts.